But that autumn, she began buying in strange patterns quantities of salt, beeswax, twine, and ink. She also asked about harder-to-find items, rare herbs, old almanacs, and even a brass compass. Finch thought little of it at first. Ashworth had always had its eccentrics, but something about the calm purposefulness of her questions stuck with him. She seemed to know exactly what she was looking for, as if following instructions. At the same time, Thomas Higgins, usually a model of punctuality, began arriving late to the post office. He was often distracted, forgetting deliveries or mixing up mail. Neighbors described him standing outside the church for long stretches, staring at its tower, unmoving. His co-workers assumed he was ill or under stress, but no one knew what was really going on behind the quiet man's eyes. At school, Margaret grew increasingly withdrawn. She stopped speaking in class and began sketching disturbing images in the margins of her textbook symbols that the teacher didn't recognize, dark shapes looming behind familiar village landmarks. Billy, once outgoing, became quiet and uncharacteristically fearful. He refused to walk past the church alone and began sleeping with the light on, something he'd never done before. Then, on the morning of November 1st, the Higgins cottage was found empty. The door was locked from the inside. The breakfast table had been set. Coats and shoes remained by the door, untouched. There were no signs of struggle, no sign that the family had packed or planned to leave. The only clue was a small bundle of dried herbs left on the front step, tied with red thread. Sergeant Henley launched a full search of the village and surrounding countryside, but nothing was found. Bloodhounds traced no scent beyond the cottage. The family had simply vanished. 3 months later, on a stormy February evening, the vestry floor in St. Mary's Church partially collapsed during a renovation. Beneath it, workers discovered a hidden room, one that didn't appear on any plans or historical records. Inside, investigators found the Higgins family's personal items, clothing, a child's notebook, a satchel belonging to Thomas. More disturbingly, they found stacks of handwritten journal pages, mostly in Eleanor's handwriting, describing rituals and invocations tied to older, long-forbidden traditions. Some entries included references to the old observances, a phrase repeated throughout. They described gatherings held under the church at night, attended by unnamed villagers. The most troubling entry was dated November 14th, to full weeks after the family had supposedly vanished. In it, Eleanor described crossing over and referred to the Veiled One, a figure never fully explained. The Church of England was notified immediately. Within a week, a team of church officials arrived from London and sealed off the chamber. The journals were removed, the room was sealed, the diocese issued no public statement, and St. Mary's resumed services without acknowledging the incident. When asked, Reverend Whitmore declined to comment. For the next 2 decades, the Higgins disappearance remained a local mystery spoken of in hushed tones, but rarely investigated further. That changed in 1985, when a legal battle over parish property rights gave investigators limited access to sealed diocesan archives. Among the files were old reports of similar disappearances dating back to the 1700s, all involving families connected to St. Mary's and the same cluster of old Ashworth surnames. One file mentioned a hidden room beneath the church, found during repairs in 1882 and immediately resealed. Another described a series of midnight gatherings held in 1911 that ended after a child fell ill. Under unexplained circumstances, the connections were too consistent to ignore. And then there was the surviving witness. In 2005, Margaret Thornton, yes, the village librarian, contacted researchers investigating historical disappearances. At 92, she had decided to speak publicly for the first time. Her testimony confirmed what many had only suspected, that certain families in Ashworth had maintained ancient rites alongside their Anglican faith, and that Eleanor Higgins had, knowingly or not, revived something long thought dormant. According to Margaret, Eleanor had begun studying the old ways under her guidance in the early 1960s. What began as curiosity about folklore evolved into something more serious. Eleanor believed the church had been built atop a site of pre-Christian significance, what she called a veil place, where the boundary between worlds was thin. The rituals she performed were meant, according to Margaret, to preserve the balance between seen and unseen. But she feared Eleanor had gone too far, delving into ceremonies meant only for those trained from birth to handle them. Margaret warned her to stop, but Eleanor, encouraged by strange visions and her children's drawings, believed she was being called to complete something left unfinished generations ago. Margaret also confirmed that Reverend Whitmore was aware of what was happening, though to what extent remained unclear. He had allowed access to the church at night, supposedly for private prayer. She suspected he believed, in his own way, that the rituals had value, or at least that they posed no harm. She believed otherwise. What became of the Higgins family remains unknown. No bodies were ever recovered. No confirmed sightings were reported. Some believe they were taken either by those carrying out the rituals or by whatever force the rituals were meant to contain or summon. Others think they fled, though why they would leave everything behind has never been explained. Today, the Higgins cottage still stands, boarded up and overgrown. Locals avoid it, especially at night. St. Mary's remains active, but attendance has dwindled. Some say the bells still sound strange on certain evenings. A few even claim to have seen a figure in the churchyard matching Eleanor's description, though these stories are never told loudly. Whatever happened in Ashworth in 1965, it left a mark on the village, on its people, and on those who dare to investigate. The documents, journals, and testimonies reveal a web of silence, tradition, and belief that continues to resist full understanding. Let me know in the comments, do you believe the Higgins family was the victim of something ancient, something forgotten, or did they uncover a truth the village was never meant to face? Subscribe if you're drawn to the stories others are too afraid to tell. And until next time, remember, sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, especially when the ground it rests on was never meant to be disturbed. That was highly unusual for the safety-conscious Higgins family. Inside, everything seemed normal, coats still hanging by the door, breakfast dishes drying on the rack, a half-finished crossword puzzle sitting on the table. But there was no sign of the family. No packed bags, no disturbance, nothing to suggest they had left willingly or in a hurry. The beds were made, clothes remained in their drawers, and Eleanor's journal sat open on her writing desk, its final entry dated the night before. Sergeant Henley launched a formal search that afternoon. Officers and volunteers combed the village, surrounding woods, and nearby hills. Bloodhounds were brought in, but picked up no trail beyond the cottage. There were no footprints, no broken fences, and no reports of vehicles leaving the village. That night, the Higgins family had vanished, leaving not a single physical clue. Local authorities were baffled. Flyers were posted in nearby towns. Inquiries were made with hospitals and train stations. And the press briefly picked up the story, but without new leads. The case quietly slipped from the headlines. It remained a whispered curiosity in Ashworth. Something not openly discussed, but never quite forgotten. Everything changed 3 months later when renovation work in the church revealed the hidden chamber. Workers restoring the flooring in the vestry discovered a hollow beneath the stone slabs. Further excavation uncovered a narrow staircase leading down into a concealed room. Unknown to anyone currently living in the village, the air was thick and musty. Untouched for decades, perhaps longer, inside the room, investigators found items that belonged to the Higgins family: Margaret's notebook, Billy's drawings, Thomas's satchel, and a set of candles identical to those Eleanor had purchased in October. More unsettling were the journal pages, many written in Eleanor's distinctive hand. These were not simple reflections, but detailed accounts of rituals, beliefs, and instructions. The entries suggested that the family had not simply vanished, they had been part of something deeper, something ancient. The final journal entry was dated November 14th, nearly 2 weeks after the Higginses were last seen. That discovery changed the nature of the investigation. The diocese was contacted, and a small group of church officials arrived quickly and quietly. The chamber was photographed and then sealed. The journals were removed and never returned. The diocese refused to comment, and the investigation lost all momentum. Officially, the case remained open but inactive. Years passed with no answers. Then in 1985, during a dispute over property lines involving the church, Lawyers were granted temporary access to sealed diocesan archives. Among the archived materials were documents referencing other disappearances families, mostly in the 18th and 19th centuries, reported missing under eerily similar circumstances. Some of these families, like the Higginses, had lived in Ashworth. Others were connected to nearby parishes. The records included witness statements, confidential reports, and references to a rites chamber beneath St. Mary's, sealed and forgotten more than once. That's when outside researchers became involved, quietly compiling reports, oral histories, and finally tracking down the person who would change everything, Margaret Thornton. By then, Mrs. Thornton was in her 90s. She had spent her life quietly guarding the library and its hidden collection of manuscripts, some passed down for generations. When she finally agreed to speak, her account confirmed long-standing suspicions. She explained that the Historical Preservation Society had not simply been about education or local pride. It had been founded as a means to continue knowledge that had survived in families like hers, knowledge that predated modern religion. Eleanor Higgins, she said, had shown a rare sensitivity to these traditions and intuitive understanding of things most outsiders found meaningless or disturbing. Her arrival had awakened something old in the village, something many believed had gone dormant but never truly disappeared. Mrs. Thornton said Eleanor believed she was called to fulfill a role tied to both ancestry and place. She warned the others, including Reverend Whitmore, that Eleanor was moving too quickly, but the group ignored her, convinced that they were reclaiming lost wisdom. Mrs. Thornton believed the family had crossed a line accidentally or not, and the consequences were irreversible. She didn't claim to know exactly what happened that night, but she was sure the chamber beneath the church had not been empty, and she was certain the Higgins family had not simply vanished. Something had been set in motion that could not be undone. After her interview, Mrs. Thornton returned to her quiet life and passed away the following year. The Higgins cottage remains empty. The windows are boarded, the path overgrown, and no one lives nearby. Most in Ashworth avoid talking about it. St. Mary's continues to hold services, but there are far fewer worshippers now. Some say the church bells don't sound right anymore. Others claim to hear whispers near the old vestry late at night. Whether you believe this was a case of forgotten rituals, community silence, or something more unsettling is up to you. Let me know in the comments. Do you think the Higgins family uncovered something they couldn't escape? Or were they part of something far older than anyone realized? If you want more stories like this, unexplained, uncomfortable, and nearly lost to time, subscribe and let me know where you're listening from. Thanks for watching. Written openly about the need for sacrifice, not in metaphorical terms, but as a literal, sacred duty. Her words were no longer those of a researcher or even a believer, but someone fully committed to fulfilling a role she saw as divinely ordained. She spoke of her children not as victims, but as vital participants in a larger plan. Her husband, once skeptical, was portrayed in her later entries as wavering but ultimately necessary for the ceremonies. Success. Sergeant Henley spent days cataloging everything he found in the chamber. The evidence was overwhelming. Dozens of journal entries from multiple decades, a clear pattern of disappearances tied to ritual practices, and personal belongings from the Higgins family, left like offerings at an altar. But despite the weight of this discovery, Henley was met with silence when he tried to escalate the case. When he attempted to file a formal report, he was instructed by his superiors to submit only a summary. Officials from the diocese arrived within days and sealed off the chamber again. The journals and artifacts were removed under the pretense of historical preservation, but Henley never saw them again. His notes were confiscated, and he was quietly transferred to another district within the year. The official story remained unchanged. The Higgins family was listed as missing, presumed relocated. No formal charges were ever brought. The Historical Preservation Society was quietly disbanded, and Reverend Whitmore retired from public life within months. He passed away a few years later, leaving behind no personal statements or explanations. Today, the chamber beneath St. Mary's remains sealed. Most in Ashworth won't speak of it. The church continues to hold regular services, but attendance has dwindled. Some locals say the air around the church still feels strange, especially in late October. Others believe that whatever was started there was never truly ended. What happened to the Higgins family may never be fully understood, but the records, the patterns, and the voices they left behind all suggest one thing: they were part of something much older, much deeper, and far more dangerous than anyone ever imagined. Let me know in the comments what you think. Was this a case of mass manipulation, or something else entirely? If you want more stories like this, ones that challenge what we think we know, be sure to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Thanks for joining me. Recent decades were re-examined in light of the evidence uncovered at St. Mary's. Although no charges were brought outside Ashworth, investigators suspected that similar patterns may have existed elsewhere, perhaps inspired by or loosely connected to what began in this quiet village. The final verdicts in the Ashworth case brought a measure of justice. Dr. Carr and Mrs. Thornton were found guilty of multiple counts of murder and conspiracy, receiving life sentences without the possibility of parole. Other members of the Historical Preservation Society received various sentences based on their involvement, ranging from lengthy prison terms to suspended sentences for those whose roles were limited to covering up the crimes. Reverend Whitmore, deemed mentally unfit to stand trial, was committed to a secure psychiatric facility, where he remained under observation. His condition continued to decline, and he passed away 3 years later, having never expressed remorse or acknowledged the full extent of his actions. In the aftermath of the trial, Ashworth struggled to rebuild. The village became known across the country not for its history or charm, but for a conspiracy so deeply rooted in tradition that it went unnoticed for decades. Many families moved away, unwilling to remain in a place where so many had suffered in silence. The church was permanently closed, and the underground chamber beneath it was sealed by order of the Home Office. It remains inaccessible to this day. The Higgins family was officially declared deceased in 1966, and a memorial was later installed near the site of their former home. It bears no religious symbols, only their names and the dates they were last seen. For Sergeant Henley, the case marked both the peak and the end of his career. Though he was praised for his persistence, he chose early retirement shortly after the trial. In a rare public statement, he said only that some truths, once uncovered, leave permanent marks on the soul. And so ends the story of Ashworth, not just a tale of murder, but a cautionary account of how belief, fear, and silence can combine to hide unthinkable acts in plain sight. As investigators closed the file, one question lingered: how many more villages, how many more quiet communities might still be hiding secrets of their own? Thanks for watching. If you found this story as chilling and thought-provoking as we did, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more deep dives into forgotten cases and hidden histories. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, especially if you've ever heard of anything similar in your own town. Neighboring villages during the same time frame began to show similar patterns, raising the possibility that Ashworth's secret wasn't an isolated event, but part of a broader network of individuals using religious or historical research as a cover for darker intentions. The exposure of the Ashworth conspiracy left a deep psychological scar on the community. Many residents had lived for years with vague suspicions or silent unease, but hadn't acted, whether out of fear, uncertainty, or social pressure. Testimonies during the trial revealed just how complex the layers of denial, fear, and complicity had become. For years afterward, many villagers struggled with guilt, questioning whether they could have or should have done more to prevent what happened. Even those who hadn't known the full extent of the crimes wrestled with a sense of moral responsibility. The realization that people they had trusted, neighbors, community leaders, even clergy, were capable of such acts shattered their faith in authority and their ability to trust others. Young people who had grown up during the years of the conspiracy were especially impacted. Many reported a lasting sense of betrayal, and some required years of therapy to come to terms with what had happened in their village. Just knowing they had unknowingly shared a community with mass murderers created trauma that made it difficult to build trusting relationships. Several residents developed symptoms now recognized as PTSD, nightmares, anxiety, and flashbacks tied to vague but unsettling memories of the time. Ashworth had once been seen as a model of rural tranquility, but after the truth came out, every corner of the village carried reminders of what had been hidden for decades. The peaceful setting that had once brought comfort became a trigger for fear and sorrow. The case also uncovered serious shortcomings in the systems that were supposed to prevent such atrocities. Over the years, various authorities had received reports of strange disappearances, but these were often written off as voluntary moves. The failure to investigate these cases more thoroughly allowed the crimes to continue unchecked. The Church of England's oversight was also called into question. Its system gave rural clergy considerable independence, which in this case allowed Father Blackwood and Reverend Whitmore to operate for decades without accountability. After the case broke, the Church implemented new procedures for monitoring parish activity and screening clergy. Backgrounds, local law enforcement came under similar scrutiny. Missing persons cases in rural areas were often handled with the assumption that families had simply moved for work or personal reasons. The Ashworth case led to reforms in how such cases are treated, including better coordination between regional police departments. Medical and social service systems had also failed. Dr. Carr, as both a physician and a conspirator, had been able to falsify records and create believable cover stories. As a result, new policies were introduced requiring outside review in cases of sudden illness or family relocation. The legal process concluded in late 1966. Everyone mentally competent to stand trial was convicted. Reverend Whitmore was declared guilty but mentally ill and confined indefinitely in a secure psychiatric facility. Dr. Carr, Mrs. Thornton, and four others received life sentences. Several more were sentenced for helping conceal the crimes. While the court acknowledged that many of these people had acted under immense social pressure, it emphasized that adults are always responsible for protecting the vulnerable. The sentencing sparked debate. Some argued the penalties weren't strong enough given the scale of the crimes. Others felt they were too harsh. Considering the manipulation many had endured, the judge struck a middle ground, emphasizing both accountability and the social dynamics that had made the conspiracy possible. The assets of the convicted conspirators were seized and used to compensate surviving relatives of the victims. Unfortunately, many families had been targeted precisely because they had no close outside ties, making compensation difficult or impossible in some cases. After the trials, Ashworth as a village could no longer function. Most residents, who hadn't been directly involved, chose to leave rather than live with the memory of what had happened. Property values collapsed, shops closed, and within months, a centuries-old community had all but vanished. St. Mary's Church was deconsecrated and later demolished to prevent it from becoming a site of morbid fascination. The underground chamber was filled with concrete and buried under grass. Even so, not all traces could be erased. The homes of the murdered families were never occupied again. The Higgins cottage, where the investigation had begun, stood vacant for years before it too was torn down. The village school closed when enrollment dropped, and the local post office shut down soon after. By 1970, only a few dozen residents remained. Most were elderly or unable to leave. What had once been a vibrant rural community had become a shadow of itself. As time passed, Ashworth's story became the focus of academic study. Criminologists, psychologists, and sociologists examined the case to understand how such a prolonged and large-scale conspiracy could exist in a small, seemingly ordinary village. The case challenged long-held beliefs about the nature of evil and the conditions under which ordinary people can be drawn into horrific actions. It also sparked wider conversations about spiritual authority and institutional accountability. Both lead perpetrators had been clergy members who used their positions to manipulate others, raising questions about unchecked religious power in isolated settings. Their actions forced religious institutions to re-examine how they train and supervise leaders in local communities. The Ashworth conspiracy also provided one of the most detailed case studies of group manipulation in modern history. It offered insight into how intelligent, rational individuals could be slowly conditioned into accepting and even participating in unthinkable crimes. This helped shape later research into cult behavior, radicalization, and extremist movements. The lessons of Ashworth are chilling. It shows how a community's trust, once twisted, can allow terrible things to happen. The Higgins family, like the many others before them, believed in the people around them. They trusted their church, their neighbors, and their leaders. They never imagined that beneath the calm surface of their village lay a network of deception and violence that had been thriving for decades. What's most disturbing isn't just the scale of the murders but the slow, careful way people were led to accept them. The manipulation was so gradual that many genuinely believed they were doing something good, even as they took part in or helped cover up terrible crimes. This case reminds us how important it is to ask questions, to stay connected with the wider world, and to speak up when something doesn't feel right, no matter how trusted or prestigious the source may seem. It also shows how isolation, both geographic and social, can create an environment where dangerous ideas grow unchecked. In the end, Ashworth serves as a stark reminder that the worst horrors aren't always committed by obvious monsters. Sometimes they come from regular people who lose their way, blinded by loyalty, fear, or belief in something they never stop to question. What are your thoughts on this story? Do you think something like this could really happen in a small, tight-knit community? Could everyday people be slowly pulled into something so horrific without realizing it? Let us know in the comments if you found this story as unsettling as we did. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more real-life mysteries that explore the darkest corners of human behavior. Thanks for watching.